Gender dysphoria is not one thing. Often we like to define it as if it were, but in doing so, we overlook the distinctions between the diagnosis in men and women, as well as across lines of sexuality. For men, we tend to define gender dysphoria as being either a coping mechanism for homosexual men to deal with a hostile world, or a fetish in the form of autogynephilia. For women, one might expect a similar method of diagnosis. While it is true that childhood onset gender dysphoria is common in women with dysphoria, namely in those who will likely grow up to be homosexual, Blanchard doesn't believe in a female counterpart to AGPs. This isn't to say that there aren't heterosexual females who choose to transition in order to pretend at a homosexual relationship. There are, and these women are easy enough to find evidence of in online spaces. However, instead of calling this phenomenon autoandrophilia, he defines this as autohomoeroticism. Autohomoeroticism occurs in heterosexual females who are sexually attracted to men, but wish to undergo sexual reassignment surgery so that they may have homosexual relations with a man. It is not as obvious in childhood as it may be with homosexual transsexual women, and therefore can appear as rapid onset gender dysphoria. In other words, while AGPs are attracted to the idea of having a woman's body, autohomoerotics are attracted to the idea of participating in gay male sex. The distinction lies not in wanting to be male because the concept of being male sexually arouses them, but instead the concept of being a participant in gay sex, which is fetishized by them. Particularly of interest is how many trans-identified females were previously involved in online shipping culture, including fujoshis and other male homosexual fetishizing communities. However, this is not the only type of classification for trans-identified females. The most commonly talked about and most thoroughly recorded is child-onset gender dysphoria, but it should be noted that autogynephilic and rapid-onset gender dysphoria have very different causes and presentations than childhood-onset gender dysphoria, and research cannot necessarily be generalized to cover the other types. Child-onset gender dysphoria typically occurs in homosexuals and occurs in childhood for both boys and girls. It is characterized by an early appearance of gender nonconformity, which Blanchard describes as a persistent tendency to behave like the other sex in a variety of ways, including preferences of dress and appearance, play style, playmate preferences, and interests and goals. A very gender nonconforming boy may dress up as a girl, play with dolls, dislike rough play, show indifference to team sports or contact sports, prefer girl playmates, try to be around adult women rather than adult men, and be known by other children as a sissy, a term generally used to ridicule and shame feminine boys. A very gender nonconforming girl shows an opposite pattern with the less derogatory word tomboy replacing sissy. The onset of gender nonconformity is very young and typically arises when the gender behavior is first noticed. While not all gender nonconforming children have gender dysphoria, there are no known cases of childhood onset gender dysphoria without gender nonconformity. This is the only form of gender dysphoria that has been well studied in young people and young adults, and has revealed that, at least in the past, 60 to 90% of children whose gender dysphoria began before puberty adjusted to their birth sex without requiring gender transition. Now, these numbers may be changing as many homosexual advocacy groups have pointed out the disturbing pressure that many gender nonconforming youth face to transition, particularly in the lesbian community, which has a strong overlap of detransitioners. Children with childhood onset gender dysphoria are more likely to be non-heterosexual than typical children. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is a more recent phenomenon and, as such, has had less studies completed on the topic. It appears in youth who had no sign of gender dysphoria as young children before puberty. ROGD typically involves teenage or young adult females who have heavy interset involvement in a social circle which glorifies transgender phenomena and exaggerates their prevalence. The friend group typically supports the conviction that she is trans and are encouraged to believe that this identification is the root of all unhappiness and life problems one may experience, and presents transitioning as the only solution. This is typically followed by a quick path to gender transition, both medically and socially, with parental opposition leading to internalization in these communities, and at times, suicide threats and estrangement. This form of gender dysphoria is believed to be a social contagion. ROGD is not about discovering gender dysphoria that was there all along. Rather, it's about falsely coming to believe that one's problems have been due to gender dysphoria previously hidden from the self and others. This is still a form of gender dysphoria, but it is a dysphoria due to persuasion of those especially vulnerable to a false idea. It is not gender dysphoria due to anything like having the mind-brain of one sex trapped in the body of another. Generalizations of those afflicted with ROGD are as follows. The large majority of persons with ROGD are female, and the most typical age of onset ranges from high school to college ages. Persons with ROGD have a high rate of non-heterosexual identities before the onset of their ROGD. Signs of extreme social contagion are typical. For example, this occurs multiple peer group members who all began to identify as transgender. Sometimes this occurs after school-sponsored transgender educational programs. Persons with ROGD have high rates of certain psychiatric problems, especially aspects related to borderline personality disorder and mild forms of autism. In general, the mental health and social relationships of children with ROGD get much worse once they adopt transgender identities. Parents resisting their children's ROGD are not transphobic or socially intolerant. These are parents who, for example, usually approve of gay marriage and equal rights for transgender persons. You can read more in depth on this topic on Fourth Wave Now, which hosts many papers and theories by Blanchard and other academics on gender dysphoria. Just as Blanchard's AGP model allows for us to better understand the actions and behaviors of trans-identified males, research and knowledge on the females who are similarly afflicted allows us to better understand their actions, as well as to better offer assistance to those seeking peace through transition, as it is unlikely they'll be able to find it there. ROGD and autohomoerotics are female-specific in the same way that autogynephiles are male-specific afflictions. While autohomoerotics are said to be a minority of transsexual females, they present a unified homophobic force along with autogynephiles who attempt to pressure gay men and women into relationships with them. This, dear viewers, is where we part. Personally, I find this topic to be very interesting because a lot of the discussion tends to be mostly on the men who have trans identification. And I think part of this is simply that it's not so much of a threat. I mean, you're not really going to have an issue with trans men entering male spaces. Typically, they're very quiet about it, and there doesn't seem to be that same sort of fetishization. And then, of course, there's also the fact that trans men are not as strong as men. And so, to an extent, if they blend in, that's fine. And if they get caught, like if they're trying to do anything there, it's very easy to stop them because of that strength difference, if that makes sense. But I do think it's interesting how it's homoeroticism for females. And it's really something that I can see traces of going back to when I was in high school. Like, I distinctly remember these girls who would sit at lunch and she would just draw Fuda characters, which if you don't know, don't bother looking it up. And I just remember so many other girls being super obsessed with, like, having ships like that. I mean, not that I'm not a fan fiction nerd, but there was a certain difference in the role it played in our lives, I guess is the best way to put it. But anyhow, I think it's interesting that this topic is one that's not really heard about much. And of course, this is going off of Blanchard's research. So it's a theory. It's one that's kind of hard to test because ROGD is still very recent. But it's one that I think holds water in the same way that I think the AGPs hold water, although AGPs has a lot more support already finished and completed before this trend really got big. We'll actually be talking a bit more about ROGD going later on, particularly with the Satanic Panic in the 90s and 80s, which I think is a really fun topic. Particularly just, I really love learning about, like, weird court cases. Not like true crime, like murder stuff, which can be kind of glorifying and fetishy of death, but like the other stuff, like when they had that school scandal of testing scores, or when there was a 7-year court case where they tried to prove that this one daycare center had committed a bunch of satanic crimes, and it was the most expensive case, like, in American history, and they never actually solved anything. So anyhow, if you guys like, comment questions, concerns, etc. in the comment section down below. Don't forget to join memberships because, haha, I'm poor and trying to leave Cambodia. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.